Hello, thank you for tuning in for another video. Today I will be discussing some beginner knitting tips as well as 10 patterns that I recommend for beginners to start either as their first project or a very early project to learn new techniques. So let's get into it. Hello, if you're watching this when I am posting it, it is almost Christmas, so if you celebrate, Merry Christmas. If you don't, I hope you're having a great time. Happy almost end of the year. Today I am filming a video about some of my biggest tips for beginner knitters, as well as some patterns that I recommend for beginner knitters to check out or to knit either as a first project or an earlier project. So I'm filming this because one of my watchers recommended I do a video like this, that they would like to see it, and I believe that I am well suited to make this video. I started knitting in June of 2022. It is now December 2023, so I've been knitting for a year and a half now, and I have gone from making garments like this. This is my first project where, it's all seamed together, different colors. It's in a worsted weight acrylic yarn, and all of the purl stitches are twisted. So going from this, which was the first garment, and they're not even woven in, the first garment I made in June 2022, I started it, I finished it in September 22, compared to one of my most recent finished objects, which is another cardigan. I'll have details about these two patterns down below as well, but it is a completely seamless garment. It's a raglan construction. If you are interested, I'll explain a little bit about what that means later. With twisted rib and this cabling detail. And this one I started in November 2023 and finished within 2 weeks. So, both the complexity of what I am knitting, the gauge at which I'm knitting at, and the speed at which I knit have all improved. I'm knitting at a smaller gauge, I'm knitting quicker, and I'm making more complex projects after a year and a half. So I would now call myself a adventurous intermediate knitter. I've done a lot of different techniques. I'm not scared to try new things, and I know that I have the ability to do lace, cables, color work, all of those things. I've done some of it before and have it under my belt. I've done a lot of different techniques for making garments as well. But I still also started knitting only a year and a half ago, and I remember what being a beginner is like. So I believe I'm well suited to give some of those tips from how I got from this garment to this, and to share a little bit about what I wish I knew or what not to do. So let's get into it. All right. The first tip that I highly, highly, highly recommend, which I think is one of the things that helped me gain more confidence and master techniques quicker, is to watch other people knit. If you can, go to something like a knit night in your local area. If you have a local yarn store, that is a great way to get this experience. But you can also watch knitting podcasts. There's High Fiber Knits, Laura Penrose, Pages and Pearls, or Hannah, some Woolly Worker. Those are some of my favorite podcasts to watch, to hear people talk about their knitting, and you get a lot of little nuggets of insight about how to improve your own knitting by watching people talk about it. There's also Kutuvakika does a lot of tutorials for her patterns. Her name is Veronica Lindberg, but on YouTube she's known as Kutuvakika. I will link her, and she will do full tutorials for how to knit some of her patterns. You still need to purchase the pattern if you want to knit along with it. She, keeps things like stitch counts and stuff like that out of the pattern or out of the videos, so you do have to buy the pattern. But it is a really great way to watch someone knit and learn certain techniques, even if you don't want to knit the pattern she's showing. I personally, when I was still kind of new, just watched a lot of Kutuvakika's past tutorials for her patterns despite not having the skills or the desire to knit a lot of the patterns she was featuring, just to watch someone knit and get some techniques down, because she does really in-depth tutorials. And through Kutuvakika's videos, I realized I was doing my increases wrong. I was not twisting the stitches when I was doing a make one left. So, you know, you learn a lot of things just from observing others. And, you know, knitting does have this history of being a very community-based activity. The way you learn to knit is from watching one of your family members or a friend. So keeping that alive, I think, really does make you a better knitter and gives you some of that insight that you really don't get without either learning it yourself, which takes a really long time, or consulting others to get that shared knowledge. So yeah, that is my first tip. My next tip, which I think really helps me to keep motivation in the beginning when, let's be honest, a lot of beginning knitting patterns are not the most engaging because you're just trying to get certain techniques down. You know, this is just panels of stockinette. It's not going to be the most exciting, and it shouldn't be. You want to focus on making sure you know the techniques, but what really helped me was to find a stretch goal pattern, and then find patterns to kind of work up to that. So for me, in February of this year, 2023, knit the sweater number 15 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. I'll have a picture here, but it is an all over cabled sweater. And before then, I had multiple patterns saying, you know, I decided I wanted to knit that in October of 2022, and I put it on my queue. I slowly started working up to it too. So I found a more simple cable pattern to try out. I made a little headband with some cables in it. I made another sweater, the home sweater v-neck, by Cagery, which is one of the patterns I will talk about later. But I made a lot of different patterns that had features of the sweater number 15. You know, had the drop shoulder construction, had cables to get familiar with all those techniques before I dove into this, what felt like at the time a very big project. And I'm really glad I did that, because then when it was time for the sweater number 15, I felt ready for it. You know, I knew I was combining a lot of different techniques and it would be interesting and a new experience for me, and it would challenge me, but I also knew how to cable. I knew how to pick up stitches. I knew how to do the things I would need to. And it gave me a goal and a motivation when I was working on some of those projects that I would deem as a little bit more boring. So it was very, very helpful to have a stretch goal and to know what I was working towards while I was doing some patterns that maybe weren't as inspiring for me. So yeah, highly recommend doing that. I also want to say that I've seen a lot of beginner knitters struggle with this, of being afraid to fail at something or being afraid that you are not ready to try a technique. And while I totally get that feeling, I really, really strongly recommend not being afraid to fail or give up on a pattern or have to revisit something. You know, if you can try it and watch some videos, try to learn a technique, you don't have to be nervous about failing. This is a hobby. It is a fun thing to do. If you get something wrong or you can't figure out how to do something, that's okay. Like, you can revisit it. It's not lost work either. You know, it's not like you're painting something here where, you know, the second you put something on the page, it can't be taken off. Yarn, you can always frog a project or take it back apart. So let go of that pressure on yourself to always do perfectly on the first try or to do perfectly at all. There have been many patterns that I decided I needed to revisit, that, you know, I tried something and I wasn't quite ready for the technique, and so I will revisit later. But there have also been multiple patterns where I was incredibly nervous about doing it. You know, I remember making my first sock. I was very nervous that I was not going to do it well, because you make a little heel flap, you do short rows, you pick up a lot of stitches, there's a lot of techniques in there. And I was very nervous that I was not going to do it well. I was going to end up with a failure of an object and feel bad about myself. But I did it. it was, once I got into the pattern, it was a lot simpler than I thought, and I was able to accomplish making my first pair of socks. And since then, I've really enjoyed sock knitting. And so, you know, balance, of course, balance, like not throwing yourself into a super detailed lace, cable, a lot going on sweater. So don't throw yourself immediately into that, but also don't be afraid to try something new. There are so many amazing videos online. There's a lot of amazing tutorials. You know, if you just look up whatever you're struggling with, there's probably a very nice older woman telling you how to do that. There's probably written instructions too, if that is what you prefer. You can also choose a lot of patterns that are more detailed if you want that detailed level of instruction. So don't be afraid to fail. It'll be okay. And an amazing thing too is we have a great community. If there is a local yarn store near you, I highly recommend, if you're struggling with a pattern, you can go there and ask the people who work at the yarn store, you know, I really can't figure out how to do these decreases. Can you help me read this pattern, or help me figure out what I did wrong if you've messed something up? You know, I've seen that happen a million times. I've asked questions at yarn stores to get insights. So it's, you know, there's a very supportive community around you while you are trying new things, and don't be afraid. You'll do it. You've got it. And if you fail, that's okay. It's not really a failure. It's just a room for improvement. We're gonna put a pin in this, go work on something else, get a little bit more experienced, and come back. So you'll do it. My next tip is to make a list of the things that you like about some of your favorite commercially knit or other, you know, hand knit pieces, and keep those in mind when you are choosing patterns going forward. I have a lot of things that I made because they seemed really interesting to me. They were styled well in the sample, or I thought they looked really cool. But now I realize practically for me, they don't work in my wardrobe. For me, a lot of that is bulkier knits. So when I was first starting, I made a lot of things in bulky weight yarns that now I just don't really want to wear because they are big and there's a lot of bulk. There's a lot of bulk to them. And while that is, of course, not fully a negative thing, if I had taken the time to kind of look at the sweaters that I already own and realized, you know, they are all quite thin, they're detailed, but they're a lot thinner and they're a lot closer to my body than some of these patterns that I'm looking at and knitting, I probably would have realized sooner to not waste my time making things like that. And it's not a full waste of your time if you make things that you don't like in the future, because they got you a lot of techniques, and oftentimes when you're knitting as a beginner, it is easier to use larger weight yarns because your project knits up quicker. So there's pros and cons there, but do just be considerate about the projects you are choosing, the yarns you are choosing, to make sure that they are in line with not only what you're going to enjoy making, like while you are making it, you're going to enjoy that, but also what you're going to enjoy wearing, so you don't feel guilty or feel bad because you have all of these hand knit things that you just don't want to leave your house in. So yeah. My next tip, my next tip is to not overbuy tools. It is very tempting when you first start to just buy all the kits you might need, all the cute stitch markers, you know, a whole interchangeable needle set, you know, what else did I buy in the beginning? Just so many different tools, cable needles, all of these things. But I highly recommend waiting on buying tools until you have a bit more experience and you know what you want to make, some of the workflows you will want to use while you're knitting, and things like that, just so you don't end up wasting your money, because a lot of knitting can be done with very simple tools. You know, if you have one set of circular needles in the size you need to start off with, that is perfect. You don't need to go immediately buy the $100, $200 interchangeable needle set. Use those circular needles at first and buy just the few you need in the beginning. I personally bought, you know, a whole kit of everything that you'll need to knit, and it had a bunch of different cable needles in it, and I have never used them. If you've never seen, it's one type of cable needle, but basically while you're cabling, you know, you're essentially braiding or twisting your stitches. I wouldn't say twisting, but you are reorganizing your stitches on your needles. And so you use something like this to take a few off and then knit some off your needle and put them back on. And I have like 3 or 4 of these little cable needles that I bought when I first started. And it turns out I hate using these. I would much rather use just a double pointed needle, you know, which is just a double, has 2 points on each end to knit cables rather than one of these. And so now I just have a bunch of cable needles. I also have a bunch of stitch markers like this that I don't really like these bulky plastic ones, especially when they like kind of twist on and off. I find they come off of my work really easily, and I would have been better suited just using safety pins or old earrings at first. And then once I figured out that I prefer, let me see, I don't have, I'm trying to look for, I prefer stitch markers like this, which add a little bit of whimsy to work and are fully sealed. And I've learned that from experience, because the way I use stitch markers most is on the needle, not on my knitting. And so if I'd realized that sooner, I could have saved myself some money and could have definitely saved, you know, some space in my knitting drawers. So just keep to the basics at first until you have some more experience with what things you like to knit and some of the tools that you need to complete those things, and then also some experience with seeing what other tools people use and which ones you enjoy the most or are most intriguing to you, and then get some. But yeah, just hold off. I know it's exciting, and I know it's true that like buying things for your hobby and doing your hobby are kind of 2 different hobbies almost. You know, you have there's the trope of buying books and reading books. Those are 2 different hobbies. Same with buying yarn and knitting, 2 different hobbies. So I get the drive to, you know, you're starting a new thing, you want all of the exciting stuff to come to you, but just hold off. Make sure that you're buying the things that you need and you will use them for the long term, instead of just having a lot of stuff that you won't use. That kind of goes into my next tip too, which is don't build a stash when you are first starting to knit. Only buy yarn for a project that you are starting. I highly recommend this with new projects or when you are beginning, because I have a bunch of yarn that I now don't know what to do with, because it is all in acrylic and it is bulky weight, and for me personally, I don't like that. I've realized I like a lot finer of a weight and I prefer natural materials. That is nothing against bulky weights or acrylic yarns. I think that they definitely have their place and are wonderful, and definitely a more affordable, attainable option as well. So they have their place, but for me, I prefer to kind of save up for using natural yarns. You know, this is a Surrey alpaca, baby alpaca and silk mix or blend garment, and I love it. I love the drape of it, and that makes me a lot happier than the way this garment, which is 100% acrylic in a worsted weight, makes me feel. And I should say this is in a DK weight. So, you know, I wouldn't know that though when I first started, because I was looking at beginner patterns. I was not looking to spend, this garment probably cost me $100 versus this was $45. So I was not looking to spend $100 when I first started. So this was great. Now I am willing to invest $100 because I know I'm making garments that I will really enjoy and care about. So that's to say that, you know, those bulkier weights, synthetic fiber yarns have their place, especially when you're first starting, but don't build up a stash with them, because then you will find yourself a year and a half later with half of your yarn storage taken up by bulky weight acrylic that you don't know what to do with anymore because you don't really want to knit with it, but you also don't want to throw it away or donate it because some of it's half used, all of that kind of stuff. So I highly recommend only buying yarn for patterns you are currently working on and letting yourself develop your tastes to try out different fibers, try out different weights of yarn too as you go forward, so that you realize in the future, oh, I really like DK weight or even fingering weight garments and yarns. Like, those are what I gravitate towards. And then you can kind of build up a stash of those that you know you will use and love, because it is very exciting to buy yarn. But then, you know, you don't have to deal with all of the yarn you bought when you were first starting and didn't quite know what you liked yet. My next tip, huge, very important. This might be the most important tip of all. Take care of your hands and your arms. They are your most important tool. And when you are first starting, knitting does use a fair amount of muscles. And so when you are first starting and you don't have kind of those muscles built up, it's going to tax your hands. It's going to tax your arms, your forearms. I've hurt my shoulder from knitting before. So take care of yourself. Stretch. Some of the best stretches to do, there's this, where you kind of hold the top of your fingers, pull back a little bit. Don't do this for too long, but have straight arm, do that. And then you can do the reverse of this way as well. Do those stretches frequently. This will help relieve some of that forearm pain. Move your fingers a lot. Try to keep them moving. Do some motions that are not just knitting. Take frequent breaks while you're knitting. I also really like using CBD if I do have certain pains. I have like some CBD salve that I will put on my hands. I also make sure to lotion my hands frequently because they get a lot of use when you're knitting and they can get really, really dry in the winter. And then sometimes I've gotten my hands so dry that while I'm knitting, yarn is catching on my fingers and like loose or like dry skin on my hands. So keep them lotioned, keep that CBD going, and use proper posture while you're knitting. That is how I hurt my shoulder, because I was knitting hunched over like this. Don't do that, lean back, have support for your head. Don't have your neck like this. Keep good posture and keep your hands comfortable. I highly recommend checking out the Knitting PT. She has both an Instagram and a YouTube channel. I believe she has a YouTube channel, but I'll link her socials down below. She has really, really great tips on, don't do this posture, make sure you're doing this with your hands to keep you healthy while you're knitting. It's very important because it sucks when you have an injury from knitting and you have to take time off. It feels painful. So just keep yourself out of that situation so that you can keep going in the long term. My next tip is don't try to knit everything. When I first started knitting, I completed my first garment, I was on such a high from that I declared I'm never buying another commercially made sweater again. I can knit anything I want and I don't need to buy sweaters or hats or gloves or scarves ever again. Like, I'll just make that myself. It is fine. I don't want to support that anymore. Like, this is awesome. I can just do it myself. And I did that for a year. I did not buy any commercially knit garments, accessories for at least a year. And then I slowly realized, yes, I can make most of the garments I see in stores, but I don't want to. This sweater is a really great example. This is a commercially made sweater. It was actually a gift from my boyfriend for Christmas that I so nicely picked out because those are the best gifts. Not always, but when it's nice to know that you were going to like something because you chose it. But yes, this was a gift from my boyfriend, and a year and a half ago, or more like a year ago, I would have said, no, like, I could make that. That's a really simple, easy garment. I'm not gonna buy that. I can just make it. But this sweater cost like $40. If I was going to knit this in a super fine gauge in the materials that I would want to use and make it goes over my butt. So it is a very oversized garment. It would cost me probably at least $200, if not more, to buy the yarn for this. And it's a super fine gauge and it goes over my butt. This would take me so long to make. The cowl neck itself would take me probably, I don't know, a week. It's such a fine gauge. I don't know if you can see this, but so yeah, it is a very simple garment. It is a drop shoulder stockinette sweater with 1x1 rib cuffs, a 1x1 rib cowl neck, and a 1x1 rib hem. Very simple, but I don't want to spend my time making this because I would rather spend my money in other ways to make garments that are more exciting to knit and more fulfilling to wear. And I would rather not do 3 feet, it feels like, of stockinette on almost a lace weight gauge. So I am happy to buy things like that and use my time more appropriately for things that are inspiring me. You know, it's important, one of my tips before about, you know, making a list of things you like about your commercial knits is geared towards making sure that you like the product of what you are knitting. And this tip, I would say, is a lot more geared towards the process. So make sure that you are not only enjoying your final product, but also make sure that you enjoy the process of knitting. I would not enjoy making this. I would not enjoy spending the money on it. It is a great thing to buy instead of knit. And I'm going to enjoy all the knits I am making because I am intentionally choosing things that not only I will wear and I'm going to enjoy having, but are going to be fun and engaging and not feel like a chore to knit. So, you know, this is your hobby. Keep it fun. My next tip is a little bit more, I'd say, in the weeds, but it is to play around with Ravelry. If you have not heard of Ravelry before, it is an online website that has great databases for patterns, knitting patterns, yarns, different designers, knitting projects, tons of different things, and it is wonderful. I'll link it down below. If you've never been on Ravelry, I highly recommend getting on there. So essentially, you know, you can search up, I want to make a sweater and I want it to have cables, go to the pattern database and look at what patterns they have on there. A lot of them you can just buy right off of the website. Sometimes they'll link somewhere else or say this book has a pattern like that and you can track that down. So yeah, it is a great database for finding patterns. It is also a great way to keep track of your own projects. They allow you to say, I'm knitting this pattern, here's my project for this pattern, let me take photos, let me put the yarn I'm using. It's a great way to keep track of your stash too. There's this whole stash tool to add in, you know, I have this many yards of this yarn or this many grams, which equals this many yards. Here's a picture of it. Here's where I'm storing it. And then you can assign it to projects to say, I'm using this yarn in this project, which is by this pattern, or which is from this pattern. And so you can kind of link everything and keep track of what you're knitting, the designers you're knitting from, the yarn you're using, all of that. So it is a wonderful website for knitters and crocheters as well. There is a lot of crochet on there too. And I highly recommend playing around with it when you're first starting. Get used to searching for patterns. Use kind of the filter features on the side. You can filter by so many different things as far as who, like age and size that you are looking to knit for, what yarn weight you're looking to use. You can say, I only have 400 grams of a DK weight yarn, what can I make? You can search by different types of garments or accessories to say, I want to make socks or cables, what are the most popular sock patterns, all of that. And you can search by just a term to say, like, I just kept searching Christmas and clicking socks this time of year because I really wanted to make some nice Christmassy socks. And so I was putting in Christmas, festive, tree, like things that would get me winter, things that would get me Christmassy socks on Ravelry before I eventually found the pair I was knitting. So, you know, get used to using Ravelry and you will find an amazing amount of designers and see that there is so much to knit out there, and maybe hopefully find you some patterns that you are really excited to knit and can accomplish as well. Okay, and my final tip is that you don't need to understand every step of a knitting pattern before you start knitting. I know that it feels intimidating to go into a pattern and not understand what this whole section about shaping the yoke means, or what the techniques are trying to tell you. Sometimes when you're reading a knitting pattern without having the knitting in front of you, it's not going to make sense at all, because you need that visual element to understand what they're saying. They're referencing certain stitches to say, after these certain stitches, do this. And without those certain stitches in front of you, you have no idea what it means. So I recommend going into knitting patterns with having read through them and understanding the basics of knowing the techniques that most knitting patterns will list. Like, here's the technique section at the top to say you will need to know how to do this, this, and this. If you know how to do those and you've read through the pattern, at least understand the majority of the workflow, as far as you can say when you first start, okay, I'm making the back right now. Okay, now I'm making a sleeve. Like, as long as you understand that, it's okay if you don't understand everything. The majority of the time, could not tell you what a knitting pattern is telling you to do without knitting it, because the instructions are difficult to follow if you don't have something in front of you. It's inherently a visual and a tactile activity, and so without the visual tactile elements and only the written element, it's going to be very hard to understand. So don't feel defeated if you cannot understand everything in a knitting pattern, and don't feel like you have to wait or like you can't make that pattern. Still go into it, and you will likely find that you were so scared for this section about knitting the yoke or doing this pattern detail, but once you get there and you have the stitches in front of you, it is not as scary as you think. So yeah, I highly recommend diving into things, understanding as much as you can, but letting things still come to you. So yeah, okay, those are my tips, and we're already at like 30 minutes. So I'm going to quickly run through, I have 10 pattern recommendations. I'm going to run through them pretty quickly, but I'll have photos up and everything will be linked in the description below. So my first pattern recommendation is the Oslo Hat. I think that this is one of the most recommended beginner knitting patterns. So it's by Petite Knit. She, if you are not familiar with Petite Knit, is based out of, I believe, Denmark, and is a knitting pattern machine. She has so many knitting patterns, and the Oslo Hat is one of her most popular ones. I think it has like 17,000 projects on Ravelry, and it is a great project. I personally have never knit the Oslo Hat. I just prefer a ribbed hat, but the Oslo Hat is very well loved. The techniques that you need to knit it are to know how to do stockinette in the round, which is even easier than stockinette flat because it is just knitting. It's just the knit stitch. You don't have to purl. How to do decreases. You will need to know, I believe, both how to do a knit two together and a slip slip knit, which is often abbreviated as an SSK. You can find tutorials for those. I believe that Petite Knit links tutorials on the Ravelry page or her pattern page on her website for those. You will need to know how to sew down the brim of the pattern. I believe it's of the hat. It is well explained in the pattern, and I believe there is a tutorial for it as well. And then you will need to know how to turn the work. So when you first start out and you are knitting the brim, you want to make sure that when you fold it over, you're not seeing the wrong side of the work. So you will need to turn it so that your wrong side becomes your right side when you're ready to fold your brim up. Again, this is well explained in the pattern, and don't not do this because you don't feel like you could do that. And the yarn requirements for this are a DK weight and about 100 gram skein for a medium average sized head. You can use less if you're making it for a child or a baby. You might need more if you are knitting it for, you know, a larger head size. So just check the yarn requirements for your size. But I'd say most people get the Oslo Hat out of 100 grams of DK weight or fingering weight held double, which equals a DK weight. This is a really great pattern as well for experiencing hand-dyed yarn for the first time. If you are interested in trying hand-dyed yarn, which, you know, a wonderful industry of indie dyers that are, you know, hand painting or hand dyeing this yarn. But it is pricier, so if you want a one skein pattern that is at a larger gauge than a sock, this is a great way to go. The next pattern I'll recommend, which it's another petite knit pattern, is the Sophie scarf or Sophie shawl. It's just a nice kind of triangular shawl or scarf that you wear around your neck or around your shoulders, depending on the size you choose. The techniques that it uses are an I-cord edge, which is well explained in the pattern. It is not too complicated. It's really made up of slipping stitches and knitting stitches, so I believe that you can accomplish it if you know how to do those two things. And again, well explained how to do increases and decreases. They are explained in the pattern as well, so you don't need to know exactly how to do them, but just know what certain things mean when it comes to increasing and decreasing, like what knitting two stitches together means or how to do that. And then finally, those are really the only techniques. It's a garter stitch shawl, so it's quite easy. It's just knitting and then turning your work and knitting again with just the nice edges and then the increases and decreases. And the yarn requirements for the scarf version, which is more popular, you need a DK weight yarn and about 75 grams of it for the larger size. So you would need less. You could probably get away with 50 grams if you are making the smaller version of the Sophie shawl or scarf. There's also the Sophie shawl, which uses an Aran weight yarn. I did not write this down, unfortunately. I will link both though, but it uses an Aran weight and I think about maybe 200 grams of yarn. So it's a lot bigger. So maybe start with the scarf and build up to the shawl if you want to make the shawl, or just go for the shawl if that's what excites you more. Okay, I've got to pick up the pace here. The next pattern that I'll recommend if you are interested in sock knitting is the I'm So Basic Socks by Summerlee Designs. It's a great free sock pattern. It's just a very simple, often called vanilla sock, where it's just a sock. It is another great way to try out some hand-dyed yarn if you are interested in knitting socks and interested in the world of hand-dyed yarn. Great way to combine them both. The techniques you will need are how to do a heel flap and gusset. This is well explained in the pattern, but the techniques you need for that is to know how to slip stitches, how to do some short rows, but again, it is well explained. I think that you will be able to accomplish it if you can follow the directions, and if I'm remembering correctly, there's also a video for how to do that. And the pattern, how to pick up stitches to make your gusset, how to decrease stitches, and ribbing, 1 by 1 ribbing, and then how to knit in the round at a small gauge. Most people will either use 9-inch circular needles, which is just a very small, 9-inch circumference set of needles, which have smaller points, or you can use magic loop, in which while you're going through, you have a bunch of cord out. So you're knitting half your work with kind of this big pile of cord, and then you pull it and knit the other half. So you will need to know how to do that, or be comfortable watching some videos to learn how to do one of those, or have the tools for one of them. And it uses fingering weight yarn, about 100 grams of it. Okay, we're into some sweaters here. The next pattern that I will recommend, which is on my own personal queue, but I have not knit it yet, is the Dartmoor Sweater. This is a pattern by Kadri. The techniques you need for this are the techniques, I shouldn't say you need. You don't need to go in with knowing exactly how to do all these, but the techniques you will use are a drop shoulder construction technique or type, where this is a drop shoulder, and so what you do is you knit the back first. You start at the very top of the back and you knit down, and then you pause. You pick up sleeves for the shoulder. You knit your shoulder until you knit like your right shoulder or your left shoulder until your neckline, and then you pick up stitches on the other side, knit this shoulder down, you join that, and you knit down to where the back is, and then you can join so that you have armholes and a neck hole. And then you just work in the round, and then you pick up for your sleeves and your neckline eventually. So you will use that technique in the pattern. Whether or not you know it now, I think you will be fine. It does require picking up a fair amount of stitches, so I would recommend being comfortable with that before you go into a drop shoulder construction. This pattern also will use a 1x1 rib, and decreasing and increasing stitches, and it also has a nice lateral braid detail right around the shoulder. That is a nice detail. If you are worried about that detail, it's quite easy. I've done it before. It really involves almost, if you know how to do a normal knit cast off, it is kind of a similar technique, but you leave stitches on your needle. It should be well explained. There are amazing videos about how to do a lateral braid, so I would not be worried about that. But if you also are scared of doing that, you could omit it from the pattern. So yeah, and it's knit at a bulky weight, so it would knit up pretty quickly. You know, so you have an end in sight a little bit sooner than, you know, a smaller gauge pattern. Okay, my next recommendation, this was one of the first sweaters I ever knit, and it is called the Home Sweater V-neck, also by Kadri. I think that Kadri just has some really nice, simple patterns that are great for earlier beginners. So the techniques for this, it is also drop shoulder construction, so you need to know how to pick up stitches. This is especially essential on this pattern because of the V-neck details. You need to pick up a lot of stitches to shape that V-neck. You will need to know how to do a 1x1 rib as well, and then how to decrease and increase. So, you know, I think, or I shouldn't say you need to know, you will be using. So you could learn it in that pattern, or you can go in with that knowledge. And it is at a DK weight, so it's a lot thinner, or a lot thinner than the last recommendation, but still, from my own experience, it knit up pretty quickly. I knit this in October of 2022, and I think I finished it by November. So it took me a month. It would probably take a lot less time now, but yeah, it's not too long of a knit, even though it's a lighter gauge or a smaller gauge. The next thing that I will recommend as a great way to get started knitting is to use kits. So some sellers, or some popular sellers of knitting kits where they give you the yarn you need and the pattern that you are going to make, include We Are Knitters, Wool and the Gang, Knit Picks, Purl Soho, and then often local yarn stores will have their own created kits that you can buy that include the yarn and the pattern. This is a really nice way to get started as well, because the instructions are typically written out for you, or like printed out for you. So if you want to have something digital to or physical to cross off or add your own notes to, that is very helpful. And you know that you have the appropriate yarn and the amount you need because it was provided with the pattern. One thing I will say about the majority of kits, and this is not true of all of them, but the majority of them will be seamed. And for me, I don't love a seamed construction. That is where, you know, instead of knitting like this in the round, where I knit everything in the round, I picked up stitches where I needed, and when I was done knitting, I was done with the project. Compared to this garment where you can see, I had to, let me show you on the wrong side. I had to knit a bunch of panels and then sew those together, sew them to each other and all of that to make it. You know, I find this a lot easier overall and a lot quicker and more rewarding, but seamed things still do have their place. But just beware if you are looking at some of these kits, they're most often going to be seamed, which is good and bad. But yeah, I recommend starting there and looking at those as well. They're often also a lot simpler of patterns because they're more tailored towards a beginner knitting group. So definitely check those those out. I'll link as many of them below as I can, but I highly recommend too checking out your local yarn store to see if you can find some kits from them. Okay, so now I'm getting into, I would say that these should not be your first knitting pattern. I'm going to recommend 2 patterns each for knitting lace for the first time and then knitting cables for the first time. So the lace patterns I want to recommend first are the Ode to Barbara socks. These are knit again by Summerlee Designs. She's a really great sock knitter and has a lot of really fun patterns. And so the techniques that will be used in this pattern are, and I've made this myself, I'll put up my image, are knitting lace. It is 1 lace motif that goes right down the foot or the top of the foot. And so I think it's like 14 stitches wide and it repeats every 8 rows. So I found it, this was my first experience with lace, and I found that it was not too complicated for me. It was pretty easy to memorize because you were doing it over and over, and the majority of the time it was kind of, I don't want to give too much away, but once you did it once, it was pretty intuitive with what to do next because you were basically just shifting the motif out and out. So you knew, okay, I did this, you know, on stitch 3 last time, I'm going to do it on stitch 2 this time, so it's moving this way. So I found it pretty easy. The pattern has a chart, but it also will have instructions. So if you're not comfortable reading charts yet or at all, there are written out instructions to tell you exactly what to do on each row. But if you are interested in trying out charts, you know, you can refer to the chart, which basically, instead of the instructions that tell you knit this, slip slip knit here, yarn over here, the chart will just have like a piece of graph paper almost, and we'll have your 14 stitch motif and your 8 row motif, and then just will tell you, okay, here's stitch 3, that'll have a certain symbol that means slip slip knit, or it'll have a certain symbol that means yarn over, and then you just do that and you refer to the kind of legend about what the symbols mean, and you can just read it like that rather than having to read through the written instructions. So for more complex lace and cable patterns, it will be essential to read a chart. So this is also a great way to learn how to knit a chart where you do have the backup of the written instructions if you are more comfortable with that. This pattern also, like the other sock I recommended, has a heel flap and gusset construction. So that involves picking up stitches, doing some short rows, which are pretty simple, and slipping stitches as well. So be comfortable or ready to learn those if you want to attempt this. The other lace pattern that I will recommend is called the Ashton Shawlette, and I do not have the designer's name written, unfortunately. I'm sorry about that. It'll be in the description though. So it's a little shawl. You could make it larger if you wanted by just doing more repeats, but it's a pretty good size. It'll, you know, nicely drape over your shoulders, and it's a free pattern, which is awesome. So the things about this pattern are that it has very, very good documentation of the techniques and instructions. I haven't personally knit this pattern, but I heard from a lot of people and I looked through the projects to see what people had to say, and it has, I think, about 6 pages of just instructions of how to knit the shawl, which is really helpful. It also is charted, and I think you have to rely on the chart, but there is specific instruction on how to read a knitting chart. So it does help you there as well. So the techniques you will need are the techniques that will be used are reading charts, doing yarn overs, and doing decreases. Those are some of the main techniques that you will then use to make your lace. So be ready to learn those or knowing them already. And the nice thing is, since this is free, you could download it now and look at it, read through some of the techniques, and then decide if you are ready. You know, you don't have to commit immediately because you are not buying the pattern, which is awesome. I also think that there are a fair amount of videos linked as well to help guide you through it. So that's great. Okay, on to cables. The first cable pattern I will recommend is the Irish hiking scarf. Again, I did not write down the designer's name. That was not good of me, but it will be linked down below. And this is another free pattern. It is, you know, really nice. I guess you could make it however long you wanted, but it's fairly thin And in the samples, fairly long scarf that has 3 cables next to each other throughout. So the techniques you need for this is to cable. The nice thing about this pattern, it is only one type of cable and you just repeat that over and over. So, you know, when you're knitting across, you get a fair amount of just knitting rows as well, because, you know, you cable, let's say every 8 rows. And so you have 7 rows in between each cable, or 8 rows in between each cable where you are just knitting across. And then every 8 rows you go, oh, gotta do the thing and take my stitches off the needle and put them back and do the cables. And you just do that over and over for however long you want. So it's a really nice way to just get comfortable with that. And it is knit in a worsted weight yarn, so it would knit up pretty quickly as well. If you are looking for something that to get some quick gratification with the fun of cables and to have a easy cabled finished object when you are done. So yeah, and if I did not mention, it is free, and I also have not knit this myself, but read through a lot of reviews on it, and it also said that it has really great instructions for starting your cabling journey. I also, for a cable pattern, will recommend the sweater number 15. I said this is one of my stretch patterns earlier, but the nice thing about this cardigan, or not, it's not a cardigan. The nice thing about this sweater is that there's only one type of cable, very similar to the Irish hiking scarf, and is on a 10-row repeat, so you get a lot of just knitting and purling rows. So it looks very complex when you're done because there is a lot of details going on, a lot of texture, but it is, you know, just one repeat every 10 rows, and it is a drop shoulder construction. So if you have gotten comfortable with that, I would not recommend this as the first drop shoulder garment, but if you've done drop shoulder before, you're doing a lot of the same things that you would do on any drop shoulder, with just the added every 10 rows, you do a cable. So I would recommend this. It also will use twisted rib in the cuff, this is the collar, the cuff, and the hem. It uses twisted rib, so essentially instead of just knitting and purling, you twist one, so it makes it a slightly, oh, I did that in this garment. You can see here that these knit stitches are actually twisted, and so instead of just having the way a normal knit stitch looks like that, where it's just a little V, you end up with a V where the front leg is going over. It's almost like you're crossing your legs. So that is not complicated as well. And then you also need to know how to increase and decrease. And this is in a DK weight yarn. So if you're interested in trying cabling, I would recommend this. It is a lot in a garment, but it's a pretty simple garment when you actually look at it, because it is only one type of cable. So, okay, yes. Thank you for bearing with me and joining me on this beginner knitting journey. I know that this is ending up to be kind of a long video, so I appreciate you staying here. I will try to make sure I have segments of the video as well, or chapters, so that you can just skip to the patterns or just watch my tips if you are trying to do that. But yeah, all right. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye.